In the past few hours, one of the Iranian army spokesmen has said that the war it's still a war situation, as the Strait of Hormuz is obviously the sticking point. But to couple to that is the sort of since proposal that they've given to the White House to look over. Correct me if I'm wrong here, but they want to resolve the Strait of Hormuz as one item on the agenda, and then talk about uranium enrichment, talk about other elements in subsequent peace talks, which is effectively what we were doing before, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, this is essentially what was on the table before, but with a bit more clear sequencing. It has some peculiarities in the sense that on the one hand, yes, the Iranians want the blockade lifted before anything else happens. So it sounds a bit odd to me that they would give up their key new leverage before they enter into the talks about the nuclear issue. And those talks are very crucial because the Iranians are not going to get any sanctions relief until the nuclear issue is somehow resolved.
This is The Global Gambit.
You're watching the Global Gambit podcast. My name is Pyotr Kurzin, and I am being rejoined by Trita Parsi, who is co-founder and executive vice president of the Quincy Institute. Trita, it's lovely to have you back. I think it's just for a week ago since we last speak. Yes, absolutely. To check in sort of almost like on a weekly basis at this point, where the hell we are with peace process or their lack of, and what isn't functioning inside Donald Trump's head about correct decision making. So in the past few days, there's been shifts around obviously what's happened with America and Trump's attempted assassination. I guess the first thing is really, what do you think the impact of Saturday night's event had on the calculus of both obviously Washington, but also Tehran?
I'm really unsure about that, Pyotr. I don't know if there's been any implication at all or impact at all. To the best of my knowledge, no one is making an accusation that the person who is accused of plotting this had anything to do with Iran. If such a link had been made, and if it was credible, then I think yes. But at this point, I really don't think it changes the larger situation. And the larger situation is that both sides believe that they have, within this new status quo, an ability to sustain themselves better than the other. The US side thinks that this blockade of a blockade is going to be some sort of a silver bullet, and that it's going to lead to the Iranians eventually collapsing or coming and begging for a deal in the manner that Trump keeps on saying that they are, whereas in reality, clearly they're not. The Iranians believe that this situation will lead to oil prices over 100. We saw today that they jumped quite a bit, and that Trump is really not going to be able to get to a more normal situation as long as he continues the blockade. Now, if Trump had not done the blockade, which was the other scenario I talked about earlier on, which is he kind of walks away, Iran controls the straits, but the oil is flowing because the Iranians are not going to stop the flow. They only make money if they actually charge tolls. You can only charge tolls if you let the ships through. That would actually have pushed down oil prices. Trump would clearly not have achieved much except for getting out of the war he should never have started. But it would have pushed down oil prices and the pressure on him would have reduced. He's actually pressuring himself with this blockade, because by blocking the Iranian oil, I'm not saying it's the decisive thing, but it also means that the Iranians are not letting a lot of ships through the strait either. And that is keeping oil from getting out onto the market, and it pushes oil prices further up. And the Iranian calculation is that this is going to hurt the U.S. in the long run, and the U.S. is going to have to come and cry uncle at some point.
Uncle Sam crying uncle. But no, certainly the reason I started the conversation with that is I was just kind of curious from your perspective whether it had changed the point of leverage, whether because of the domestic pressure within the United States. Now, obviously, there's claims about it being a premeditated, a false flag, internal job. I'm not going to go down there. But simply, has this changed the sort of priorities of the White House, or has it given Iran a greater sense of momentum because the America is distracted? That was more my thinking. But what I do find notable is in the past few hours, one of the Iranian army spokesmen has said that the war it's still a war situation, as the Strait of Hormuz is obviously the sticking point. But to couple to that is the sort of since proposal that they've given to the White House to look over. And I don't think we've really heard much from Washington yet about their response to that. But effectively, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but they want to resolve the Strait of Hormuz as one item on the agenda, and then talk about uranium enrichment, talk about other elements in subsequent peace talks, which is effectively what we were doing before, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, this is essentially what was on the table before, but with a bit more clear sequencing. Because what was supposed to happen was that the Iranians declared that the strait is open. Trump was supposed to reciprocate by lifting the blockade for the duration of the talks or the ceasefire, and then they would get to the table and they would hash out nuclear stuff. It's essentially the same thing right now, but it's a little bit more formalized that these are different phases. And I'm not entirely sure if this proposal is entirely correct. Again, it's only Axios that has reported, to the best of my knowledge. I've not been able to confirm it. It has some peculiarities in the sense that, on the one hand, yes, the Iranians want the blockade lifted before anything else happens. But it also means that by the time they get to nuclear talks, the Iranians don't have any other leverage except whatever they have in their nuclear program, which in the past did not turn out to be enough leverage to get a deal. Whereas prior to this, the leverage they had was higher oil prices, Strait of Hormuz, in addition to whatever nuclear assets they had. So it sounds a bit odd to me that they would give up their key new leverage before they enter into the talks about the nuclear issue. And those talks are very crucial because the Iranians are not going to get any sanctions relief until the nuclear issue is somehow resolved. So I'm not entirely clear if this sequencing is exactly correct. And if it is, what the Iranian calculation behind it was. Is it perhaps that they're actually more worried about the blockade than they give the impression of? I personally don't think so. That is not the impression I have gotten from my conversations with folks on the other side. And again, I want to emphasize, I mean, Axios gets a lot of things right, but they also get a lot of things wrong. So yeah. I'm not entirely clear how accurate this reporting is.
No, fair enough. It's a good consideration that it's really been the only major outlet that I've seen share it, and they do often seem to be ahead of the curve, but not always correct ultimately in the longer term direction of how developments proceed. But what I'm interested also is, obviously now we've got the GCC countries meeting, and I think it was about 2 hours ago, 90 minutes ago, I became aware that the United Arab Emirates have left OPEC. Now, that might be partially down to the disintegrating bilateral relationship with the Saudis, but does that tell us anything about the severity of the situation in the Strait of Hormuz, the pressure being put on the Gulf states and the lack of energy security income being made for them?
I mean, first of all, as you pointed out, it's been a long time coming. The Emiratis made noises about this already back in 2020, if not even earlier. They've had issues with OPEC believing that they're unfairly treated in terms of their oil production. But I think more than anything else, what is happening now is that the Iran war and how it has ended, or how it has evolved, it hasn't fully ended, has really put a lot of the internal GCC tensions to the fore. Many of them had very different positions vis-a-vis Iran on this. The Emirates appear to have been quite active in the war against the Iranians, and they are clearly an Israeli ally within the GCC context. And as much as all of the GCC states are upset with how much Iran hit them during the war, some of them privately are actually quite pleased that the Emiratis got hit pretty hard because of their own problems with the Emirates, because of how the Emirates have pushed the others to join the Abraham Accords. The Emirates have their own problems with the Qataris, their own problems with the Omanis, longstanding. And now we see also very fast-growing differences between them and the Saudis. And the idea of a unified GCC increasingly seems to be out of sync with geopolitical realities in the region. Particularly mindful of the fact, it was one thing when all of them kind of focused on Iran one way or another. But now you have some of them feeling that they have to figure out a new relationship with Iran. And at the same time, the Emiratis are becoming the strongest allies of Israel in the region. All of this is just, remember, GCC was created in the early 1980s as a response to Iran and Iraq. It was supposed to balance both of them. It was set up for a specific geopolitical circumstance, similarly to how NATO, etc. And these alliances evolve, but sometimes they get out of sync with reality. And they're out of sync with the very reason why they got created, in the sense that relying on the United States for GCC security is increasingly an insufficient approach. So I think the GCC as some sort of a block is increasingly, the foundation for it is no longer there. That doesn't mean that they don't have a lot of things in common, but the thing that was really pushing them together was the sense of vulnerability and threat from Iran. And in some ways that has intensified as a result of the war, but the response to it is diversified within the GCC, with some states like the UAE having really put their eggs in the Israeli basket, and others like Qatar and Oman who are very upset with Iran, but at the same time believe they don't have any choice but try to find some sort of economic integration with Iranians as a security measure in order to protect themselves in the future from any wars of this kind. And also realizing that, at the end of the day, the GCC did not matter much to Trump in his calculations about this war. Israel was much, much more important to him. And all of these GCC states had put so much stock into that relationship with Trump. And when it really mattered, it didn't matter.
Interesting. I mean, it kind of makes me think about the growing blocs that we've been seeing occurring when the Saudis and Pakistanis signed that defense pact in November or October of last year. It was a significant, I think, but quite unexpected development. And the Pakistanis are going to be helping to train Saudi military personnel and things. But as you say, since then, we've had the Saudis and the UAE deviate even more after events in Yemen. And now we seem to have these two blocks, these two regional power blocks, Turkey on one side and arguably Qatar sort of floating around as well. You could even pull in India by extension because of Pakistan, obviously. But I guess what does that mean for the calculus of Iran? If you've got these different brokers trying to counterbalance against each other by sort of joining sort of minilateral blocks, how does that influence the decisions of the IRGC? Because they're no longer really the same regional hegemon or player that they were relative to a year ago or two.
I mean, it all depends. I doubt that these states will move towards some sort of an arrangement in which they're trying to get together in order to balance Iran. I think the Iranians are worried about it. They're worried that the Pakistanis, the Turks, the Saudis, and the Egyptians will use this, embryonic mechanism constellation as a way of balancing Iran. At the same time, I think many of them have also gone pretty far in trying to include Iran into it and viewing Iran more as a partner against what they see increasingly as a real problem, which is a hegemonic Israel, rather than an entity that needs to be balanced. Now, at least that was before the war. I don't know where the Saudi thinking is on this at this point after the war. They're very upset. They're also arguably in a worse position than they were in before. This war did not benefit them, did not end up weakening Iran in the manner they may have hoped. It has in many ways strategically enhanced Iran's position. And of course, the toll is something that is very difficult for the Saudis and others to accept. That would give the Iranians a significant geopolitical leverage that they don't want to see fall into the hands of the Iranians. But the idea that you would now go towards some sort of an effort to balance against Iran, when the most powerful country that could have helped you with this, the United States, has proven itself to be somewhat incapable. Yes, of course, the US can constrain Iran and balance Iran and contain and sanction Iran. But when push came to shove and there was a war, the United States failed. And Iran's ability to play its geography, shape its terrain, etc., proved to be much more effective than anyone had expected on the Western side or the GCC side. I think a lot of us who were worried that there would be a lot of challenges with this war were also proven wrong in the sense that the things we thought would happen was that there would be a very weak Iran, a potentially state collapse, instability, etc. None of those things have happened. Instead, the Iranians have come out strategically victorious and helped shape a new geopolitical reality.
Mm. So one of the things that I also saw was that the head of the IRGC, is it Ahmad Vahidi,
Vahidi.
there's quite a large, or he and some of his most senior officers were essentially blocking some of the more pragmatic parts of the system from trying to find a solution. Maybe this was partly mentioned in the Axios report, but do you have any insight or understanding of what the differences of opinion there are within the Islamic Republic? Is there more of a consensus towards trying to find a deal, or more of a consensus towards holding out pain, enduring it and causing as much pain towards the Americans as possible?
I think the data that we do have points to the fact that the idea that they are so divided is highly, highly exaggerated. It's a narrative that is put forward by Trump in almost every tweet because it's a way of shifting the blame. It is essentially to say the reason why we have this problem is because the Iranians can't negotiate. They don't have their act together. I think anyone who looks at this honestly see that the problem is not that the Iranians cannot negotiate, but that Trump can't. So, for instance, you saw that in the first round of talks, Ghalibaf led the delegation, and he brought the largest delegation from almost every political faction. They all showed up. They were there to negotiate. They didn't manage to get to an agreement, but it's unclear whether that was because of Iran or because of the US or because of both of them feeling that it might be a little bit premature to immediately come to an agreement. Both of them could have ended up being criticized for giving up too much too fast. Sometimes these negotiations have to take a longer time in order to really drive home the point that there was a tough negotiation. But you saw that not only did they do that, and then afterwards, the Iranians did signal that they will open up the Strait of Hormuz. Trump was supposed to reciprocate by lifting the blockade, and he didn't. And that's why we ended up in this deadlock that we have right now. Trump proved himself not to be able to be trustworthy even for a very limited step-by-step confidence-building measure. Now, if the Iranians were really that divided, we would not have seen the Iranians take that first step. Some people point to the fact that afterwards they closed it. Yes, but they were united in closing the strait because the US did not reciprocate as it was planned. That's not a sign of division. That's a sign of unity within that system. And since then, we have not seen them going or signaling any different directions on how they want to see the negotiations going forward. Now, will there be, can there be, must there be, should there be? Yes, there will be divisions within that system as negotiations proceed. That's always the case, in which as these negotiations proceed, new opportunities, new constellations, new offers, new challenges emerge. And there will not necessarily be unity on exactly how to respond to each proposal, etc. That's to be expected. The question is, will those divisions be so intense that they jeopardize the negotiations? So far, we have not seen any divisions on the Iranian side reach that level. We've seen divisions on the American side do so. I mean, Trump himself said that the Iranians made this offer and that all of his advisors were in favor of it. And he himself decided, I'm not going to do it because I don't want the Iranians to get $500,000 a day or whatever he said they would get from lifting from the control of the straits. And he said, so I pulled back. So according to Trump himself, his advisors were in favor of the step-by-step, and he pulled back. So why are we talking about the Iranians having a divided system? This is really striking me how effective the administration is to be able to push a narrative in the absence of evidence, whereas the evidence for the other narrative is overwhelming in many ways, but doesn't get as much oxygen.
Well, certainly there's the dysfunctionality within the US government. I think it's pretty clear that's because it's being led and established or with the vision of Donald Trump or their lack of. So there's no questioning that. But can we really say that there isn't any discontent or divergence of opinion between?
There is, yeah.
I mean, look at
absolutely.
I'm thinking of the hardline faction I remember it when I came across it, the Paydari, or linked to Paydari, right? And the difference between, say, the parliamentary speaker, I forget his surname, Ghalibaf, is it right?
Ghalibaf, yeah.
and some of the more, I don't know what, pragmatists, moderates, the restrainers, there seems to be distinctions between them and even what's being set by Mojtaba. So am I missing something here? Is that too simplistic?
No. Look. Are there divisions? Again, as I said, I'm sure there are. I'm not entirely sure we know that much about what's going on in that system. We don't really know exactly the state of Mojtaba. There's been some reporting. I haven't found many of them particularly credible of exactly what his state of affairs is. It's not whether there are divisions. There always are. And particularly the Iranian system has been known for a lot of divisions. It's whether the current impasse in the negotiations are a result of those divisions, or if those divisions are just the kind of normal level of divisions that you have in any government in a very sensitive, extremely sensitive, almost existential negotiation. And again, that's where I don't see the evidence. But other than that, obviously there are. You can see it in Iranian society that there are, I can't put a number on it, but strong voices that are very skeptical of the negotiations because of their experience, because of the US is walking out of the JCPOA, because of it bombing Iran twice in the negotiations, and a belief that war actually delivers more for the Iranians, particularly given how this war has gone, the negotiations. And as a result, they're hesitant or opposed to the idea of what they think would be premature negotiations. Despite that, we did see them all show up with a very large delegation in Islamabad, and they did take the initial step for de-escalation and an exit ramp that was supposed to pave the way for the second round of negotiation. But it was Trump, according Trump himself, who negated that, did not follow through, disagreeing with his advisor who all thought that he should. And that's how we ended up in the current scenario.
So what does this tell us about the state, the functionality of the Iranian economy, of the institutional frameworks that make up the country? Because there's been a lot of speculation about just how much Mojtaba was functioning. He hasn't been seen. We haven't heard him speak before. If we see some kind of rapprochement between the two sides, a more comprehensive ceasefire established, will we see some kind of clear, visible unity moving forward in Iran, or it's going to remain hard to tell because of the remnants of the conflict?
I think it will be very, very difficult to tell. I would suspect that if this war ends in a manner in which sanctions are lifted, the system may end up becoming more open, even in an early stage, because of a sense of confidence. But if the war ends in a manner in which the Iranians do not manage to translate their strategic victory into a new, stable, uncontested order in which sanctions are lifted, then you're going to have a very dire economic situation internally. That's going to lead to a lot of conflict. And I fear that in that scenario, the system will be even more repressive going forward in order to be able to keep their own control. Right now, there's a bit of an unusual situation. Because of the war, there's a significant amount of nationalism, sense of unity. That doesn't mean that people have forgiven or forgotten all the problems of the theocracy or that they're in favor of it, but it's a second priority compared to the imminent problems of the present. But once the war is over, those other problems are going to come to the surface. And the question is, in what position will the government be to deal with those issues? Based both on its own internal divisions, but also on what the circumstances of the ending of the war are. If sanctions relief is not there and they have, on top of their dire economic situation, incurred another $300 billion of damages as a result of the war, it's going to be a devastating situation. They're not going to be able to keep control very effectively, and they will likely start exercising even further repression of the population in order to keep that control.
So my penultimate question is simply, I remember looking at data from the election in 2024, and one of the biggest frustrations for a lot of Iranians was corruption, the internal dealings of the government. But now, if we're going to have this more securitized state, the IRGC has a much bigger say than it ever used to. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. And it seems a lot more decentralized, because that was one of the key things Ali Khamenei did after Operation Midnight Hammer or the 12-Day War, was to decentralize command and control so that they could respond in any kind of scenario as this. So what happens there then? Do we see a re-centralization of that control? Do we see them trying to win round the hearts and minds of Iranians? What would be the priorities for the government in the country in the time before a peace deal is established, but also in the days after? Well, that's too early.
I think, again, it's very difficult to predict that at this point, because it so much depends on the circumstances in which the war actually comes to an end. If it turns out that despite all of the high prices that they have, costs that they have paid to this war, there won't be any sanctions relief, Iran is going to be in a paradoxical situation in which its deterrence is strengthened, its strategic position is enhanced, but its economic situation is even more devastating than before. Now, will it be able to translate some of that strategic benefit in terms of getting more countries to disregard American sanctions? Yes, there will probably be a movement towards that. Will that be in any way, shape, or form sufficient? No. Compared to full-scale sanctions relief, it's negligible at the end of the day. And just kind of going along with a very bad situation in the long run is setting Iran in a very negative trajectory, domestically, but also ultimately internationally. It will make it very difficult for the Iranians to be able to turn that deterrence into a long-term security benefit for themselves. So it all depends on what happens in the next couple of weeks, as most likely this current status quo will give in to either an escalation or a de-escalation through diplomacy.
So I was speaking to Ross Harrison of the Middle East Institute yesterday, and he made quite an interesting point about threshold testing, which I'm sure you're familiar with, but this idea that each state is obviously testing how far the other is willing to go, what their threshold, what their saturation is. So, and he gave some interesting illustrations of how each side is doing that. So what do you think the others could still do? What could the Iranians do to maximize this game of chicken effectively, even more if they do?
I think what you might see is that depending on which side starts to believe that actually the status quo is not very beneficial to it, you will see the US side, for instance, going after more tankers, try to make high profile confiscations of ships, many of them far away from the Indian Ocean. They will try to take them on the high seas elsewhere. There's talk now about a potential air blockade as well. So you may end up seeing the US escalating because it realizes that its own faith in this blockade of the blockade turned out to be misplaced just as much as its faith in the war was misplaced, just as much as its faith in assassinating the supreme leader was misplaced, as much as its faith in thinking the Iranians would capitulate by simply amassing the US Navy in the Indian Ocean was misplaced. So this may end up being just another one of those fake silver bullets for the American side. You can have the opposite scenario in which actually the blockade ends up becoming more painful to the Iranians. The status quo as a result of the blockade ends up becoming more painful to the Iranians than to the American side. And then I will expect to see that the Iranians will start doing things to challenge that status quo and try to even out the cost. And that could be direct confrontation with some of the American ships, harassment of them with the small speedboats, with drones and things of that nature. It could also be the opening up of another front. We've seen that the Iranian horizontal escalation has been quite successful in the region so far or within this war. So unfortunately, there's still plenty of things they could do. Most of them I don't think would necessarily be particularly helpful. At the end of the day, it would be much better for them to adopt a more realistic standpoint and get to serious negotiations. And I would say that the main problem here is with Trump, who throughout all of this had very unrealistic positions or understanding of where reality is. We would not be in this situation at all had it not been for him being convinced by the Israelis that the Iranians are so weak that war will be very quick. It will either quickly lead to them collapsing or them capitulating. And both of those assessments were fundamentally wrong.
Well, it sounds like the special operation, which would only last 4 days, which reminds me of a certain SMO, which was supposed to last 3 days in Ukraine. But I do have a question, if I can be cheeky enough, Trita, which is simply that, we're looking at this primarily through the bilateral dynamics here, but what about the third parties here? What could we expect from the Gulf states? I've just seen an interesting bit of analysis emphasizing that, clearly this is going to have repercussions for the US Gulf relationship, for the petrodollar, but also for the Gulf relationships with Iran. I was seeing tacitly that the Saudis and Iranians were not normalizing relations, but they were just trying to accept that the reality of the situation was what it was, right? China's reapproached Oman a few years ago and maybe even try to increase economic activity. But clearly after the events of the past few weeks, the alarmism that has been developing in the different capitals around the Gulf, in Iran's willingness to involve them as targets. What do you think third parties are going to be doing and thinking about all of this, particularly in the context of Iran?
I think this is going to be one of the biggest questions going forward, which is to see how will Iran's relations with its Arab neighbors in the Persian Gulf evolve? Will there be a movement towards establishing a new security architecture for the region that is no longer based on the containment of one side, the isolation of one side, the balancing of it by bringing in extra regional forces, and instead move towards an inclusive security order that is based on collective security, regional integration, and economic independence? That, I think, would be the right strategy. The question is that too premature? Are emotions still too high on the two sides of the Persian Gulf because of a lot of anger? Are the GCC too disunited to be able to move in that direction? And instead, you will see some of them go in that direction and others going in the opposite direction, potentially the UAE. It's unclear, but what I think is absolutely clear is that any return to the previous status quo is a losing proposition. It didn't work. It led to war. And in that war, the GCC were the biggest losers. So they have to move in a different direction. But it requires that there is a significant level of maturity and openness on all sides, including on the Iranian side, particularly if they believe that they have won. They have to be very graceful in that victory in order to be able to lock in a new order that is uncontested, rather than just getting a new de facto status quo, but is constantly contested by regional state as well as by the United States.
Nothing ever happens in isolation, does it, Trita? And the layers here are just insane, but that's why we always like to hear from you and have you back. So Trita Parsi of the Quincy Institute.
Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone, for watching. We'll see you soon. Take care.